Sergeant Curtis Culin watched another Sherman tank burn. The crew managed to get 2 men out before the ammunition cooked off. The other 3 didn't make it. That was the 4th tank he'd seen destroyed that morning, and it was only 0900 hours. All 4 had died the same way, belly hit while climbing a hedgerow. The pattern was sickeningly predictable. Tank approaches hedgerow. Tank tilts upward to climb. Thin belly armor exposes to German anti-tank gunner waiting on the other side. Panzerfaust fires. Tank explodes. Crew burns. Repeat. Culin had been in Normandy for 6 days, and he'd seen this same nightmare play out dozens of times. The math was brutal. At this rate, the American armored force would be destroyed within weeks, and they'd barely advanced 5 miles from the beaches. June 12, 1944. D-Day had been 6 days ago, and the massive invasion that was supposed to liberate France had ground to a complete halt. Not because of German tanks, not because of artillery, but because of hedgerows. These weren't the decorative hedges you'd find in an English garden. Norman hedgerows were ancient barriers that French farmers had built over 1,000 years to mark property boundaries. Thick walls of earth, stone, and tangled roots, some 15 feet tall and just as wide at the base. The roots went down 10 feet or more, intertwined with rocks and packed dirt that was hard as concrete. And they covered Normandy like a maze. Every single field was surrounded by these natural fortresses. The French called it bocage country. American tank crews called it hell. Culin sat on an ammunition crate near the aid station, watching medics work on the 2 survivors from the latest burning Sherman. One had burns covering half his body. The other was in shock, staring at nothing, his hands still trembling. They were the lucky ones. Their 3 crewmates were still in the tank, or what was left of them. Recovery crews would pull out the remains later, if there was anything left to recover. This was Culin's job. He was part of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, assigned to support operations and help with vehicle recovery. That meant he saw the aftermath. He helped pull burned hulks away from hedgerows. He saw the penetration holes in the belly armor where Panzerfaust warheads had punched through. He'd helped remove bodies from destroyed tanks, when there were bodies to remove and not just ash and fragments. The images haunted him. The smell of burned flesh mixed with diesel fuel became something he couldn't escape. He'd wake up at night smelling it, seeing the faces of crew members he'd known, remembering how they'd joked that morning before climbing into their tank for the last time. The bocage was turning the American advance into a slaughter. Allied planners had expected to be 30 miles inland by now, racing toward Paris. Instead, they were stuck in this network of ancient farm barriers, advancing maybe a few hundred yards per day when they advanced at all. Every field was a separate battle. Every hedgerow was a fresh problem. The Germans didn't need massive reinforcements. They just needed to wait behind these 1,000-year-old walls and destroy American armor 1 tank at a time. The tactical problem was geometry. When a Sherman approached a hedgerow and tried to climb over it, the front of the tank would rise upward as the tracks grabbed the sloped earth. The entire 30-ton vehicle would tilt backward at 25 or 30 degrees. This exposed the tank's belly, a flat plate of armor only 1 inch thick, compared to the 3-inch frontal armor. That belly plate was designed to protect against mines and ground obstacles, not against shape-charge anti-tank weapons fired from a few dozen yards away. German soldiers with Panzerfausts would position themselves on the far side of hedgerows and simply wait. They didn't need to see the tank approaching. They could hear it. The sound of a Sherman's engine was distinctive. When the sound got close, they'd watch the top of the hedgerow. The moment a tank's hull appeared, tilting upward, exposing that thin belly armor, they'd fire. The Panzerfaust was a simple weapon, a disposable tube that launched a shape-charge warhead. But against 1-inch belly armor, it was devastating. The shaped charge would punch through the steel plate like it was cardboard, and the jet of superheated metal and explosive force would tear through the crew compartment. Ammunition would detonate. Fuel would ignite. The tank would become a crematorium on track. Crew members had maybe 10 seconds to get out if they were lucky. Most weren't lucky. Culin had watched tank commanders drilling their crews on emergency bailout procedures. Driver goes out through his hatch. Bow gunner follows. Main gunner and loader go out through turret hatches. Tank commander goes last, making sure everyone gets out. In theory, a well-trained crew could evacuate a hit tank in 15 seconds. In practice, when the interior was filled with flame and smoke and the screams of wounded men, most crews never made it out. The psychological toll on tank crews was severe. Men who'd fought bravely across North Africa and Sicily were refusing to advance in Normandy. They'd seen too many friends burn. They knew the odds. Climbing over a hedgerow in a Sherman was essentially suicide if Germans were on the other side. And Germans were always on the other side. Some crews had started refusing orders. Officers had to threaten courts-martial to get tanks to advance. Morale was collapsing as fast as the attack schedule. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st U.S. Army, was under enormous pressure from Supreme Commander Eisenhower to maintain momentum. The whole strategy for liberating France depended on breaking out of Normandy quickly, before the Germans could bring up reinforcements. But how do you break out when your armor can't advance without being destroyed? Bradley had pushed his engineers to find solutions. They'd tried everything. Explosive charges placed at the base of hedgerows could blast gaps, but it required combat engineers to approach under fire, plant demolitions, retreat, detonate, then wait for dust to clear. The process took 20 to 30 minutes per hedgerow. There were thousands of hedgerows. Plus, the explosions advertised exactly where Americans would attack, giving Germans time to reposition their anti-tank weapons. Some units tried using artillery to destroy hedgerows before tank advances. They'd drop hundreds of shells on a single barrier. The ancient roots and compacted earth would absorb the explosions with barely a scratch. Hedgerows that had withstood 1,000 years of Norman weather weren't impressed by high explosives. Bulldozers were brought up to try pushing through hedgerows mechanically. The dozers would get tangled in root systems that were thick as steel cables, stall out, and become sitting targets for German gunners. Engineers tried modified plows attached to tanks, thinking they could dig under the root. The plows would hit rocks or impossibly dense earth and either break or jam. Every solution failed. Every day more tanks burned. Every night, Culin would see more replacement Shermans rolling up to the front, knowing most of them would be destroyed within days trying to cross hedgerows. The replacement crews, fresh-faced kids from training camps in England, would arrive optimistic and confident. 3 days later, the survivors would have that 1,000-yard stare that came from watching their friends burn alive. Culin started carrying a small notebook, the kind soldiers used for letters home. But he wasn't writing letters. He was sketching diagrams and writing observations, measurements he'd paced off from destroyed tanks to the hedgerows they'd been trying to cross, angles of tank hulls when tilted upward, notes about root density and soil composition. His crew mates thought he was obsessed. Maybe he was. But Culin couldn't just watch men die without trying to do something. He'd been a cab driver in New York before the war, maintaining his own vehicle, fixing mechanical problems that would have cost a fortune at a shop. He'd learned that every problem had a solution. You just had to look at it from the right angle. The hedgerow problem wasn't really about the hedgerows. It was about exposure. It was about geometry. If a tank could go through a hedgerow instead of over it, punch straight through at ground level while keeping its thick frontal armor facing forward, the Germans would be facing 3 inches of sloped steel that their Panzerfausts couldn't penetrate. The tactical problem became an engineering challenge. How do you cut through 10 feet of 1,000-year-old earth and roots while maintaining forward momentum? Culin didn't have an answer yet. But as he watched another column of replacement tanks roll past on June 12th, heading toward the front where most of them would die, he knew he had to find one. Somewhere in this nightmare there was a solution. Something simple that everyone was missing because they were too close to the problem. He just had to find it before more good men burned. That afternoon, Culin was sent on a supply run to Omaha Beach to pick up spare parts. The route took him across the beach where D-Day had happened 6 days earlier. The sand was still littered with debris from the invasion, destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, shell craters. And everywhere, scattered like some giant's discarded toys, were German defensive obstacles. Thousands of them. Steel frameworks called Belgian Gate, teller mines on post, and strange three-pointed steel structures the intelligence guys called Czech hedgehogs. Culin had driven past these obstacles a dozen times, but this time something made him stop. He parked his jeep and walked over to examine a hedgehog more closely. The obstacle was made of 3 heavy steel I-beams, each about 6 feet long, welded together at their centers to form a 6-pointed star. No matter how you dropped it, 3 points would always touch the ground and 3 would point upward. The Germans had designed them to stop tanks. The exposed points would catch on a tank's underside. But they'd failed. The invasion had succeeded, and now these obstacles were just scrap metal littering the beach. Culin ran his hand along one of the steel beams. It was heavy, hardened steel, industrial strength welds, built to withstand being run over by 30-ton vehicles. And that's when it hit him. These steel beams were exactly what he needed. Strong enough to penetrate compacted earth, heavy enough to provide mass and momentum, hardened enough that they wouldn't bend or break. And they were everywhere, thousands of them, free for the taking. The idea formed in his mind completely and instantly. Take these steel beams, cut them to length, sharpen the tips, weld them to the front of a Sherman tank at a downward angle. When the tank hit a hedgerow, instead of climbing, it would ram straight through. The steel prongs would dig into the base of the barrier like giant teeth. The tank's mass and momentum would rip through roots and earth. The tank would maintain level attitude, keeping frontal armor facing forward. The Germans would be facing impenetrable armor instead of vulnerable belly plate. It was so simple, so obvious. Why hadn't anyone thought of this? Culin pulled out his notebook and started sketching right there on the beach, using the hood of his jeep as a desk. He drew side views of a tank with prongs attached. He calculated angles. 15 degrees downward seemed optimal. He estimated spacing, 4 prongs across the front hull, positioned about 2 feet apart. He could see it working in his mind. The physics were sound. Steel beats dirt. Momentum overcomes resistance. This could work. But having an idea was different from implementing it. Culin was a sergeant, not an engineer. He had no authority to modify tanks. He'd need permission from officers who might think he was crazy. He'd need welding equipment, cutting torches, time, and a tank to experiment on. All of this in a combat zone where resources were scarce and everyone was focused on immediate survival. As Culin drove back from the beach with his jeep full of spare parts and his notebook full of sketches, he made a decision. He was going to pitch this idea to his commanding officer. The worst they could say was no. The best case, he might actually save some lives. Either way, he had to try. Because tonight, more Shermans would burn trying to cross hedgerows. Tomorrow, more crews would die. And Sergeant Curtis Culin had just figured out how to stop it. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin Jr. of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron wasn't an engineer. He had no college education. Before the war, he'd been a cab driver in New York City. But he understood machines. He understood leverage and force. And as he watched yet another Sherman burn after trying to climb a hedgerow, something clicked in his mind. The problem wasn't the hedgerows themselves. The problem was that tanks were trying to go over them instead of through them. If you could somehow cut through the hedgerow at ground level, plow straight through instead of climbing, the tank would never expose its vulnerable belly armor. The Germans couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. But how do you cut through 10 feet of packed earth, stone, and 1,000-year-old root? Culin started sketching ideas in a notebook. His crewmates thought he was crazy. Culin's at it again, they'd joke. Going to solve the whole war with his little drawings. But Culin ignored the skepticism. He'd learned that people underestimated mechanics. Every good mechanic was a problem solver. Every repair was a puzzle. The hedgerows were just another kind of stubborn machinery that needed to be persuaded. Then Culin saw something that changed everything. Down on the Normandy beaches, scattered everywhere, were German defensive obstacles, Czech hedgehogs. These were anti-tank barriers made of heavy steel beams welded together, designed to stop Allied landing craft and vehicles. They'd failed at that purpose, and now thousands of them were just sitting there as scrap metal. Steel beams. Heavy, hardened steel. Culin looked at those hedgehogs and saw teeth. Massive metal teeth that could be welded to the front of a tank and driven through hedgerow roots like a plow through dirt. The idea was so simple it seemed stupid, but the physics were solid. 30 tons of tank, driven by hundreds of horsepower, pushing steel prongs into ancient earthworks. Something had to give, and it wouldn't be the steel. Culin approached his commanding officer with a proposal that sounded insane. He wanted to take a Sherman tank, cut up German beach obstacles, weld the steel to the tank's front, and ram it through a hedgerow at full speed. The officer, some accounts say it was Captain Robert Doughty of the 2nd Armored Division, stared at Culin like he'd lost his mind. "Let me understand this, Sergeant. You want to weld scrap metal to a tank and deliberately drive it into a wall of dirt and roots at full speed. That's your plan?" "Yes, sir," Culin replied. "The current plan is to drive tanks over hedgerows where they get shot in the belly. My plan keeps the armor facing forward at all times. If we never expose the underbelly, they can't kill the tank." The logic was sound, but it was still crazy. Welding modifications to tanks in a combat zone, using untested equipment. If it failed, good tanks and crews would be lost. But if it worked, how long would it take to build this thing? The officer asked. "Give me 2 days, some welding equipment, and permission to scavenge metal from the beach. I'll have a prototype ready." The officer made a decision that would change the Normandy campaign. "You have 48 hours. If this doesn't work, we're both going to be explaining ourselves to some very angry generals." Culin saluted and got to work immediately. He rounded up a welding crew, grabbed acetylene torches, and headed to the beaches. The Czech hedgehogs were perfect, heavy steel beams that had been designed to withstand tank impact. He cut them apart, trimmed the beams to about 4 feet long, sharpened the tips, and reinforced the weld. By the end of the first day, he had 4 prongs ready, each one thick as a man's arm and hard as railroad track. The next phase was trickier. He had to weld these prongs to a Sherman's front hull without compromising structural integrity or interfering with movement. The prongs had to be angled correctly, low enough to dig into the base of the hedgerow, spaced wide enough to rip through a broad section, strong enough to withstand impact without snapping. "You really think this will work?" asked one of the welders helping him. "I know it'll work," Culin replied, adjusting his welding mask. Steel teeth driven by 30 tons of tank. Something's got to give. By dawn on the second day, the modification was complete. The Sherman tank now had 4 steel prongs extending from its front like tusks. Soldiers gathered to look at the strange creation. Some were impressed. Others were skeptical. More than a few took bets on whether Culin would be court-martialed or commended. "Looks like a pig trying to mate with a porcupine," one soldier joked. Culin patted the steel prong affectionately. "Maybe so. But this pig's about to root through every hedgerow between here and Berlin." By late July 1944, the Culin hedgerow cutter had become standard equipment on American tanks in Normandy. This timing was critical because General Bradley was planning Operation Cobra, the massive offensive that would finally break out of the Normandy bocage and allow Allied armies to race across France. The operation kicked off on July 25, 1944, with a massive aerial bombardment followed by ground assault. American armor, now equipped with hedgerow cutters, punched through German defensive lines that had held for weeks. What would have been a grinding, costly advance became a breakthrough. Tanks that previously would have been stopped by every hedgerow now breached through multiple barriers without slowing. The German defensive system in Normandy had relied heavily on the natural obstacles of the bocage terrain. When American tanks suddenly gained the ability to negate those obstacles, the entire defensive concept collapsed. German units found themselves being outflanked and surrounded as American armor moved through terrain the Germans had considered impassable. Within days, Operation Cobra had torn a massive hole in German lines. Within weeks, Allied forces were racing across France. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. By September, Allied armies were approaching the German border. The Normandy breakout, which military historians credit in significant part to the hedgerow cutter, had succeeded beyond even optimistic projections. Curtis Culin never claimed his invention won the war. He was too modest for that, and too aware of all the other factors involved. But military analysts who studied the Normandy campaign concluded that the hedgerow cutter had shortened the bocage fighting by weeks, possibly months. Every day saved meant lives saved, resources conserved, momentum maintained. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, later called the Culin hedgerow cutter one of the most significant tactical innovations of the war. Official Army reports credited it with materially contributing to the successful conclusion of the Normandy campaign. Curtis Culin didn't sleep the night of June 14th. He lay in his tent listening to distant artillery fire, running through every possible way his invention could fail. The prongs could snap on impact. The welds could break. The tank could get stuck, embedded in the hedgerow like a beetle pinned to a board. The whole contraption could just bounce off the ancient earthwork, accomplishing nothing except making him look like a fool who'd wasted 2 days and valuable resources while men died at the front. At 0400, he gave up trying to sleep and walked to the maintenance yard where the modified Sherman sat in darkness. He ran his hands along the steel prongs, checking welds by feel, looking for any cracks or weaknesses he might have missed. Everything felt solid. The steel was cold and hard under his palms. These prongs had been designed by German engineers to stop 30-ton tank. Now they were going to be driven through 1,000-year-old Norman earth by a 30-ton American tank. Something had to give. Private Kowalski found him there an hour later, sitting on the ground with his back against the tank's tracks. "Couldn't sleep either, Sarge?" Kowalski asked, offering a canteen of terrible coffee. "Kept thinking about the test. This is either going to be the best idea anyone's had in weeks, or we're both going to be digging latrines in a punishment detail by tomorrow night." Culin took the coffee and drank it without tasting it. "The math works, Eddie. The physics is solid. Steel beats dirt and root. Momentum and mass do the work. It should work." "Should," Kowalski repeated. "That's the word that's keeping me awake." By dawn, word had spread through the regiment that something unusual was happening. Soldiers drifted toward the maintenance area to see the strange tank with steel tusks welded to its front. Some thought it was brilliant. Most thought it looked ridiculous. A few officers were openly skeptical that a sergeant's field modification could solve a problem that had stumped trained engineers. Captain Doughty arrived at 0630 with 2 other officers Culin didn't recognize, a major with engineering insignia and a colonel from division headquarters. Culin's stomach dropped. This wasn't just a local test anymore. Division was watching. If this failed, it wouldn't just embarrass him and Doughty. It would embarrass everyone up the chain of command who'd authorized this experiment. "Sergeant Culin," Doughty said formally, "this is Major Patterson from the Corps of Engineers and Colonel Williams from 2nd Armored Division Headquarters. They're here to observe your demonstration." Culin saluted. Major Patterson walked around the modified tank, examining the prongs and welds with a critical engineer's eye. "Interesting approach, Sergeant. Crude, but the concept is mechanically sound. The question is whether those attachment points will hold under the stress of actual impact. You're asking a lot from those welds." "The welds are solid, sir," Culin replied, trying to keep his voice steady. We used proper techniques, multiple passes, reinforcement gussets. The mounting plates distribute stress across the hull. It'll hold. We'll see, Patterson said noncommittally. Colonel Williams was more direct. Sergeant, I've got 36 Shermans sitting in salvage because they tried to climb hedgerows and got their bellies shot out. I've got tank crews refusing to advance because they know what happens when you go over these hedgerows. If your modification works, it solves my biggest tactical problem. If it doesn't work, I've wasted a morning watching a demolition derby. So let's find out which it is. The test site was a field 2 miles from the maintenance yard. The regiment had selected a particularly massive hedgerow, 12 feet tall, ancient, with roots that probably went back to the Norman conquest. If Culin's prongs could breach this monster, they could breach anything in Normandy. The test crew had volunteered: driver Corporal Jake Mitchell, gunner Sergeant Tom Harrison, loader Private Danny Chen, and tank commander Lieutenant Frank Morrison. They were either brave or crazy, possibly both. As the modified Sherman rumbled toward the test site, a crowd gathered. Word had spread faster than Culin expected. Dozens of soldiers lined up along the edges of the field to watch. Some were taking bets. Culin heard fragments of conversation as he walked past. $20 says it gets stuck. I say the prongs snap off on impact. My money's on the whole thing bouncing off like a rubber ball. Nobody seemed to be betting on success. The Sherman took position about 100 yards from the target hedgerow. Lieutenant Morrison opened his hatch and looked at Captain Doughty for final instructions. The morning sun was just clearing the horizon, painting everything in golden light that made the scene feel surreal. "All right, Lieutenant," Doughty called out. "Take her straight in at speed. Hit it dead center. If you feel anything breaking or failing, abort immediately. We don't need dead heroes today." Morrison gave a thumbs up and dropped into his hatch, buttoning it closed. The Sherman's engine pitch changed as Mitchell shifted gears and began accelerating. Culin's heart was hammering so hard he thought everyone around him could hear it. This was it. 48 hours of work, all his calculations and theories and hopes, about to be tested against reality. The tank picked up speed. 10 miles per hour. 15. 20. The sound of the engine became a roar. The distance to the hedgerow closed rapidly. 50 yards. 30. 20. Culin could see the steel prongs pointing forward like spears. 10 yards. 5. The impact was catastrophic. The sound was like a bomb going off. The entire tank shuddered and for a fraction of a second seemed to stop completely, 30 tons of steel meeting immovable earth. Dirt exploded outward in all directions. Roots snapped with sounds like rifle shot. A cloud of dust and debris erupted, completely obscuring the tank. For 3 endless seconds, nobody could see anything. The dust cloud hung in the still morning air. Soldiers held their breath. Then, slowly, movement in the cloud. The dark shape of the Sherman pushing forward. The engine was still roaring. The tank was still moving. More roots snapped. More earth cascaded off the hull. The nose of the tank tilted down slightly, not up exposing the belly, but down, keeping frontal armor forward. The prongs were working. They were actually working. Culin felt his knees go weak. The Sherman pushed deeper into the hedgerow, disappearing completely into the mass of earth and vegetation. For a moment, only the engine sound indicated the tank was still there. Then, with a final surge, the Sherman burst through the far side of the hedgerow. The tank emerged into the field beyond, trailing dirt and torn roots, all 4 prongs still attached, all welds intact. The tank had created a perfect breach, wide enough for other vehicles to follow, executed in less than 15 seconds, accomplished without ever exposing the vulnerable underbelly. The watching soldiers erupted in cheers. Men were shouting, throwing their caps in the air, slapping each other on the back. The betting pool had apparently just cost a lot of skeptics their money. Lieutenant Morrison popped his hatch and climbed halfway out, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "Smoothest hedgerow crossing I've ever experienced," he shouted across the field. "We barely felt the impact inside. The prongs went through that thing like a hot knife through butter, and we never once exposed our belly to enemy fire. Culin felt someone grab his shoulder. It was Kowalski shaking him. It worked. Sarge, it actually worked. Did you see that? We just solved the hedgerow problem. But Culin was watching the officers. Their reaction mattered more than the cheers. Major Patterson was walking toward the breached hedgerow, examining the path the tank had created. Colonel Williams was talking rapidly into a radio handset. Captain Doughty was heading toward Culin with an expression Culin couldn't quite read. "Sergeant Culin," Doughty said when he reached him, and Culin snapped to attention. "Sir, that was either the craziest thing I've ever seen or the most brilliant. Possibly both." Doughty paused, then smiled. "Definitely brilliant. You just did in 15 seconds what's been stopping our advance for 6 weeks. Colonel Williams approached, having finished his radio call. "Sergeant, how many of these modifications can you produce? And how quickly?" Culin's mind raced through calculations. "Sir, if I get enough welders and access to more hedgehog obstacles from the beaches, my crew could modify 10 tanks a day. Maybe more if we really push it and set up an assembly line system." "Not good enough," Williams said sharply, and Culin's heart sank. Then Williams smiled. "I'm getting you 50 welders, priority access to all the scrap metal you need, and authorization to commandeer any equipment necessary. I want 100 tanks modified by the end of the week, and I'm sending a report to General Bradley immediately. This invention is going to change everything." Major Patterson returned from examining the breach. "Colonel, I've inspected the hedgerow penetration. The prongs created a clean path approximately 8 feet wide, suitable for vehicle traffic. The hedgerow structure is completely compromised at the breach point. It won't provide cover or concealment to enemy forces. And I examined the tank's attachment points. All welds held. No visible stress fractures. The modification is structurally sound." Williams nodded, then turned back to Culin. "Congratulations, Sergeant. You're no longer the mad mechanic with a crazy idea. You're the genius who just unstuck the entire Normandy invasion." But Culin wasn't ready to celebrate. The professional part of his mind knew that one successful test under controlled conditions didn't prove the concept would work in combat. "Sir, with respect, we need a combat test. Real enemy positions, actual German fire. That's the only way to know if this will truly work when it matters." Williams's expression became serious. "I thought you might say that. There's a German strongpoint 3 miles from here. They've been holding up our advance for 4 days. Every approach is blocked by hedgerows. Every attempt to breach has been suicide. Battalion wants it taken, but nobody's figured out how to get tanks through without losing half of them." He paused, looking at the modified Sherman, then back at Culin. "If your modification works there, under fire, against a prepared enemy position, you'll have proven your concept beyond any doubt. And you'll have saved American lives doing it." "When do we go, sir?" Culin asked, though he already knew the answer. "Tomorrow at dawn. I'm assigning you to ride with Lieutenant Morrison's crew as technical observer. If there are problems with the modification in combat, you need to be there to see them and understand why." Culin swallowed hard. He'd been hoping to stay back at the depot, just building more modifications. But Williams was right. He needed to see his invention in actual combat. Only then would he know if the design needed improvements. Only then could he honestly say it was ready for mass production. "Understood, sir. I'll be ready." That night, Culin checked and rechecked every weld on the test tank. He measured the prong angles again. He examined the mounting plates for any stress damage from the test. Everything looked perfect, but combat was different from a controlled demonstration. In battle, nothing went according to plan. Private Chun found him working late by lantern light. "Sergeant, you should get some rest. Big day tomorrow." "Can't sleep, Chun. Too much thinking." "You scared?" Culin considered lying, then decided honesty was better. "Terrified. This thing works in theory. It worked in one test. But tomorrow, people's lives depend on whether I got the math right. If I made a mistake somewhere, if there's a design flaw I didn't see." "We trust you," Chen interrupted. "You built this thing. You know it better than anyone. And tomorrow, we're going to plow through those hedgerows and show the Germans they can't hide anymore." Culin wished he had Chen's confidence. But all he could do was prepare as best he could and hope that his crazy idea was actually genius. Tomorrow would be the real test. Tomorrow, his invention would face German defenders who'd spent weeks perfecting their hedgerow ambush tactic. Tomorrow, Curtis Culin would find out if he'd built something that saved lives, or if he'd just created a more elaborate way to get good men killed. He worked until midnight, then finally forced himself to stop. The tank was ready. The design was sound. The only thing left was to see if war would be kind enough to let his mathematics and mechanics overcome the chaos and violence of combat. As he walked back to his tent, Culin looked up at the stars and thought about all the tank crews who died in burning Shermans trying to cross hedgerows. If his invention worked tomorrow, there would be fewer stars looking down on burning American tank. That was worth the fear. That was worth the risk. Tomorrow at dawn, they'd find out if a cab driver from New York had really figured out how to beat the hedgerows of Normandy. The combat test came the next morning. Culin's modified Sherman, now nicknamed Rhino by the crew, would lead a small column toward a German position that had been stopping American advances for 3 days. Intelligence said there were at least 2 machine gun nests and possibly an anti-tank gun positioned behind the hedgerows. Standard tactics would mean exposing tanks to devastating fire. The Rhino represented a different approach. Culin rode along as a technical observer, positioned where he could see how his modification performed under actual combat conditions. His stomach churned with nervous energy. If this failed, if the prongs snapped or the tank got stuck or any of 1,000 things went wrong, good men would die. And it would be his fault. The Rhino approached the first hedgerow with German positions on the other side. No hesitation, no slow climb. The tank accelerated and hit the hedgerow at speed. The impact was massive, but the prongs bit deep. Earth and roots exploded. The tank punched through in seconds, emerging on the far side before the shocked German machine gun crew could react. The Sherman's main gun fired first. One high-explosive round that eliminated the threat before the Germans even reached their weapons. "It works," someone shouted over the radio. "It actually works in combat." The Rhino continued forward, breaching hedgerow after hedgerow. Each time, the tank emerged before Germans could bring weapons to bear. Infantry following behind were ecstatic. For the first time since D-Day, they could advance without being pinned down by hedgerow defenses. Then came the real test. Intelligence had warned about a German anti-tank gun positioned behind a particularly massive hedgerow. If the Rhino got stuck breaching that barrier, it would be a sitting duck. The tank commander made a split-second decision. They'd breach at speed, gambling that surprise and momentum would carry them through before the Germans could respond. The Sherman surged forward. The impact was the hardest yet. This hedgerow was thicker than any they'd hit. For a terrifying moment, the tank seemed to slow. Then the engine howled, the tracks churned, and inch by inch, the Rhino forced its way through. They burst out the other side at an angle, gun already trained on where the German position should be. There it was, a PK-40 anti-tank gun, its crew frantically trying to traverse their weapon to track the unexpected target. The Sherman fired first. The armor-piercing round struck the gun shield, and the German weapon was silenced. The infantry caught up, securing the position. An officer approached the Rhino, grinning broadly. "Sergeant Culin, I don't know what kind of magic you worked, but you just did in 2 hours what we've been trying to do for 3 days." Culin climbed out of the tank, his legs shaky. He'd done it. The design worked not just in a controlled test, but in actual combat against real enemy positions under fire. Word spread fast. Within hours, reports were climbing the chain of command. Within days, General Omar Bradley himself had heard about the sergeant with the welded scrap metal who'd solved the hedgerow problem. Bradley ordered immediate mass production. Every tank depot in Normandy received orders to begin installing what were now officially called Culin hedgerow cutters, or rhino devices. The army brought in welding teams from engineering battalions across Normandy. They scavenged more Czech hedgehogs from the beaches. The very obstacles Germany had placed to stop the invasion were now being repurposed to break through their defensive positions. They set up assembly lines in fields, working around the clock. Culin found himself pulled from his unit and assigned to train welding crews. He went from depot to depot, showing them the exact angles for the prongs, the proper welding techniques, the reinforcement methods that would keep the cutters from snapping under stress. The key, he'd explained to each new group, is that the prongs have to dig in low. Too high, and the tank tilts up and exposes its belly. Too low, and they just plow dirt without cutting root. You want them positioned exactly here. He'd mark the spot with chalk, at about a 15-degree downward angle. Within a week, hundreds of tanks had been modified. Within 2 weeks, over 1,000. The transformation was remarkable. Suddenly, American armor could advance through the Bocage country without the suicidal exposure that had been costing so many lives. Tank casualties from belly hits dropped dramatically. The pace of advance increased. German defensive positions that had seemed impregnable were suddenly vulnerable. The psychological impact on German defenders was significant. They'd relied on the hedgerows as natural fortifications. When American tanks started plowing through barriers that were supposed to be impassable, it shattered German confidence in their defensive positions. After-action reports captured later in the war showed German confusion. Enemy armor is now passing through hedgerows without exposing vulnerable areas. Unknown how this is being accomplished. General Bradley visited one of the tank modification sites personally. He found Culin training a welding crew. "Sergeant Culin, I presume?" Culin snapped to attention, recognizing the stars on Bradley's collar. "Yes, sir." "At ease, Sergeant. I came to see the man who unstuck my army." Bradley smiled. "Your invention is brilliant in its simplicity. We've been throwing sophisticated solutions at the hedgerow problem for weeks, and then you come along with scrap metal and a welding torch and solve it in 2 days." "Sir, I just did what needed doing." "That's what good soldiers do," Bradley said. "I'm recommending you for the Legion of Merit, and I'm authorizing a field promotion to technical sergeant." But the recognition made Culin uncomfortable. He was being lauded as a genius, receiving medals and promotions, but men were still dying in Normandy. His invention was helping, but the war was far from over. "You okay, Sarge?" one of his crew asked. "You don't seem excited about all this." "I am," Culin replied quietly. "I just keep thinking about all the crews we lost before this invention. What if I'd thought of it sooner?" "You can't think like that. You can't save the guys who died before. But you're saving the guys who are still alive. Every day, more tanks with your cutters are rolling through hedgerows. Every day, fewer crews are burning. That's what matters." Curtis Culin returned home to New York after the war, carrying his Legion of Merit and Bronze Star, but ready to leave combat behind. He went back to civilian life, working various jobs, raising a family. He never talked much about the hedgerow cutter. When people would ask about his war service, he'd deflect. "I was a mechanic. Fixed some tanks. Nothing exciting." He didn't mention the medals, the innovation, the fact that his invention had changed the course of history. His family once asked him why he never discussed his wartime achievement. "I'm proud of what I did," Culin replied quietly. "But I'm not proud of what it was for. I made a tool that helped kill people. It saved American lives, which matters. But it was still about killing. I'd rather focus on the present." Over the decades, military historians gradually recognized the significance of the Culin hedgerow cutter. It appeared in books about the Normandy campaign, in documentaries about World War II innovations, in military training manuals as an example of field-expedient engineering. But Culin himself remained largely unknown outside military history circles. In the 1980s, historians tracking down veterans of the Normandy campaign finally located Culin and interviewed him. He was elderly by then, but still sharp, still modest. "Do you understand how significant your invention was?" a historian asked. Military analysts estimate it shortened the Normandy campaign by weeks. It saved thousands of lives. Culin was silent for a long moment. Then he said something the historian would quote extensively. "I wasn't special. I was just a guy who knew how machines worked and saw a problem that needed solving. The special part was that the Army gave me a chance to try. How many other good ideas got dismissed because they came from the wrong person? I got lucky. My idea got tested. But I guarantee there were 100 other guys with equally good ideas that nobody listened to." "But your idea worked," the historian pressed. "That makes you special." "My idea worked because people gave it a chance," Culin corrected. "That's the real lesson. Not that I was some genius, but that good ideas can come from anywhere if you're willing to listen." Curtis G. Culin Jr. died on May 13, 1963, in Cranford, New Jersey. He was 52 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he'd been a veteran and worked various jobs. It didn't mention the hedgerow cutter. Most of his neighbors never knew that the quiet man who'd lived among them had changed the course of World War II. But in military museums across America and Europe, examples of the Culin hedgerow cutter are preserved. Chunks of steel welded to the fronts of Sherman tanks. Simple, crude-looking, but revolutionary in their effectiveness. Plaques explain what they are and what they did. And they mention the name Curtis G. Culin Jr., the sergeant who refused to accept that problems were unsolvable. The Culin hedgerow cutter represents something larger than just one tactical innovation. It's a story about how warfare rewards adaptability, how simple solutions can solve complex problems, and how innovation can come from unexpected places. Military historians studying the Normandy campaign point to several factors that contributed to Allied success: air superiority, naval gunfire support, overwhelming material advantage. But they also point to the hedgerow cutter as an example of tactical innovation at the squad level making strategic impact. One sergeant with a welding torch and scrap metal had accomplished what teams of engineers with advanced degrees couldn't. The hedgerow cutter also changed how the U.S. military thought about field modifications and soldier innovation. After World War II, the Army established more formal systems for collecting and evaluating ideas from soldiers at all ranks. The assumption that expertise only came from the top down had been proven wrong. Good ideas could come from anywhere. Modern military doctrine now emphasizes adaptability and field innovation as core competencies. Special operations forces in particular train their personnel to improvise and modify equipment based on mission requirements. This traces back, in part, to lessons learned from innovations like Culin's hedgerow cutter. The story also reminds us that warfare creates problems that peacetime planning can't anticipate. American planners had studied maps of Normandy, but they'd underestimated how the bocage terrain would impact armored operations. They'd trained for breakthrough and exploitation, not for grinding hedgerow-to-hedgerow fighting. When unexpected problems arose, the solution came not from headquarters, but from a sergeant who saw things differently. Today, preserved examples of hedgerow cutters can be found at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, the Bovington Tank Museum in England, and various other military history collections. They look primitive, just steel prongs welded to tank hulls. But they represent one of those rare moments when a single individual's ingenuity changed the course of history. Curtis Culin never sought fame. He never wrote a book or gave lectures. He returned to civilian life and lived quietly. But his legacy endures in military doctrine, in museum exhibits, and in the survival of thousands of tankers who came home because their Shermans could punch through hedgerows without exposing their bellies to enemy fire. The sergeant with the scrap metal and the crazy idea had done something remarkable. He'd seen a problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable, and he'd solved it. Not with advanced technology or complex engineering, but with simple physics, practical mechanics, and the willingness to try something nobody else had thought of. That's the real story of the Culin hedgerow cutter. Not just what it did, but what it represents. The power of individual initiative, the value of practical problem-solving, and the reality that sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places.